What if the most terrifying horror icon in modern cinema wasn't born in a Hollywood writer's room, but inside a quiet apartment where two young nursing students swore something inanimate was watching them? What if the fear wasn't crafted with jump scares and orchestral stings, but with handwritten notes that appeared when no one was home, furniture that shifted positions overnight, and the slow, suffocating realization that something unseen wanted to be acknowledged? Before the cameras, before the scripts, before the chilling performances, there was a case file. And inside that file was a doll. The real Annabelle was not porcelain-faced and gothic. She did not have glassy eyes that followed you across the room. She was a simple Raggedy Ann doll, soft, harmless-looking, almost absurdly innocent. In 1970, a mother gifted the doll to her daughter Donna, a nursing student living with her roommate Angie in Hartford, Connecticut. The apartment was ordinary. The lives they lived were ordinary. Which is precisely why what followed still unsettles investigators decades later. The events did not begin with violence. They began subtly. Donna would leave the doll on her neatly made bed before going to class. When she returned, it would be sitting upright on the couch. At first she laughed it off. Perhaps Angie moved it. Angie denied it. They blamed each other casually, but over time the incidents became harder to dismiss. The doll began appearing in different rooms entirely. Sometimes it would be found kneeling, hands placed delicately on its lap. Sometimes it appeared to have locked itself inside Donna's bedroom, though either woman remembered doing so. Skeptics argue memory is unreliable and perception is fragile. That is true. Cognitive psychology shows that expectation shapes interpretation. Yet what disturbed Donna and Angie was not just movement. It was communication. Small pieces of parchment paper began appearing around the apartment. The handwriting was uneven and childlike. The message repeated in variations. "Help us." The women insisted they did not own parchment paper. They used notebook paper, the kind common among students. The parchment seemed to appear from nowhere. It was found on desks, on beds, sometimes crumpled on the floor. It felt deliberate. Fear is rarely immediate. It grows in layers. Donna and Angie began to sense what they described as a presence. Not constant, not aggressive, but aware. A mutual friend named Lou was the first to react strongly. He distrusted the doll from the beginning. He claimed he had vivid dreams in which Annabelle hovered over his chest, paralyzing him. Sleep paralysis is well documented in neurological studies. It can produce terrifying hallucinations. But Lou's experiences did not remain confined to dreams. One afternoon, while alone in the apartment, Lou heard rustling sounds from Donna's bedroom. He assumed an intruder had entered. He approached cautiously. The room was empty. Except for the doll. Annabelle lay on the floor. As he moved closer, he felt what he later described as sharp pains across his chest. His shirt tore. When he looked down, there were scratches. 7 distinct claw-like marks. They burned for hours before fading over days. No animal was found. No sharp furniture edges matched the wounds. Physical evidence changes the psychological equation. Scratches introduce biology into belief. Were they self-inflicted unconsciously? Could stress have played a role? Perhaps. Yet the combination of movement, written messages, and now physical harm pushed the young women to seek help. They contacted an Episcopal priest, who in turn reached out to investigators who were becoming increasingly known for examining cases involving alleged hauntings. Those investigators were Ed and Lorraine Warren. At the time, they were building reputations that would later inspire films like The Conjuring and the broader cinematic universe that introduced Annabelle to millions. When the Warrens arrived, they did not treat the case as a possessed object scenario initially. According to their account, a psychic medium had earlier told Donna and Angie that the spirit of a deceased girl named Annabelle Higgins had attached itself to the doll. The spirit, they were told, felt lonely and wanted love. It asked permission to inhabit the doll. Out of sympathy, the women agreed. Here is where the case shifts from sentimental haunting to something darker. The Warrens concluded that there was no child spirit. They believed the entity was inhuman, manipulating the women's empathy. In demonology theory, objects are not possessed in the way people are. They are used. A spirit attaches itself to an object to gain influence. The goal is not companionship. The goal is escalation. An escalation, the Warrens warned, was coming. The doll was removed from the apartment. It was placed in the back seat of the Warrens' car. According to their reports, the vehicle experienced brake failure multiple times during the drive home, nearly causing accidents. Holy water was allegedly applied. The disturbances stopped. The doll was eventually sealed inside a glass case in the Warrens' Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut, with a sign reading plainly, "Warning. Positively do not open." That museum has since closed following Lorraine Warren's passing in 2019. Yet the doll remains. Investigators who have studied the case remain divided. Some see a classic example of suggestion, fear contagion, and narrative reinforcement. Others see patterns consistent with cases they cannot easily dismiss. The true story behind Annabelle is not about cinematic spectacle. It is about how ordinary people interpret extraordinary experiences. It is about belief, vulnerability, and the possibility that something unseen exploits both. And this is only where the file begins. When Ed and Lorraine Warren removed the doll from Donna's apartment, they did not describe the case as a random haunting. They framed it as a textbook example of spiritual infestation moving toward oppression and eventual possession. In demonological terminology, infestation begins subtly. Objects move. Sounds occur. Written messages appear. Oppression escalates into psychological and physical attacks. Possession, the final stage, targets a human host. According to the Warrens, Annabelle was never the endpoint. She was the doorway. To understand why investigators still debate this case, we have to step beyond horror mythology and into two parallel frameworks that attempt to explain it. One comes from religious demonology, particularly Catholic doctrine. The other comes from cognitive science and abnormal psychology. The Warrens' interpretation aligned with Catholic teachings that non-human spirits may attach themselves to objects to gain influence over a physical environment. Official Catholic exorcism guidelines emphasize discernment. They require psychological evaluation before declaring demonic involvement. Most reported cases are ultimately attributed to mental health conditions, environmental stress, or misinterpretation of natural phenomena. Genuine demonic cases, according to church authorities, are considered extremely rare. In the Annabelle case, no formal church exorcism was publicly documented in the way other famous cases were. The doll was instead contained. That containment itself became symbolic. It transformed an alleged threat into a museum artifact. It shifted fear from the private sphere into the public spectacle. Now consider the psychological dimension. Research in environmental psychology shows that expectation can alter perception dramatically. If individuals are primed to believe a location is haunted, they are more likely to report anomalous sensations such as cold spots, feelings of being watched, or unexplained sounds. The power of suggestion is not weakness. It is a feature of human cognition. Our brains are pattern recognition machines. When confronted with ambiguity, we fill in gaps. Donna and Angie were young, living away from home, immersed in demanding nursing studies. Stress affects sleep cycles. Sleep disruption increases susceptibility to vivid dreams and hypnagogic hallucinations. Lou's reported paralysis episode aligns closely with sleep paralysis, a well-documented neurological state in which the body remains immobile while the brain transitions between sleep stages. Visual and tactile hallucinations are common. The sensation of pressure on the chest is so universal that folklore around the world describes similar experiences, from the old hag in Newfoundland to shadow figures in modern urban legends. But scratches complicate the psychological explanation. 7 claw-like marks are difficult to dismiss without evidence of self-infliction or environmental cause. Yet human skin is surprisingly vulnerable. Minor abrasions can appear from unnoticed contact with rough surfaces. Memory reconstruction can exaggerate their severity over time. Trauma research shows that emotionally charged experiences are remembered vividly but not always accurately. Details shift subtly with retelling. Skeptics argue that once a narrative framework of haunting was introduced by a psychic medium, confirmation bias took hold. Every anomaly reinforced the haunting hypothesis. Random events became intentional acts. The parchment paper, for example, may have existed in the apartment without conscious awareness. Once discovered, its origin felt mysterious. The phrase "help us" is ambiguous. It invites projection. Who is us? A child spirit? The women themselves? The ambiguity deepens fear. Yet here is the unsettling truth. Even experienced investigators who approach such cases skeptically sometimes report patterns they cannot easily categorize. The Warrens claimed that the entity attached to the doll exhibited intelligent behavior. It adapted. It tested boundaries. In demonological literature, deception is central. The spirit presents itself as harmless to gain trust. Once permission is granted, escalation follows. The idea of permission is psychologically fascinating. By consenting to let the spirit inhabit the doll, Donna and Angie symbolically surrendered control. In many cultures, ritualized permission carries profound meaning. Anthropologists note that belief systems often include rules about invitation. Vampires in European folklore cannot enter a home uninvited. Spirits in various traditions require acknowledgement to act. These motifs reflect a deeper human concern about boundaries and agency. What makes the Annabelle case endure is not physical violence. It is ambiguity. No definitive footage exists of the doll moving. No forensic report conclusively proves paranormal cause. The museum containment preserved mystery rather than resolving it. Visitors who stood before the glass case often reported discomfort. Some claimed to feel dizziness or nausea. Others laughed nervously. A few allegedly mocked the doll and later suffered accidents. These anecdotal reports circulated widely, reinforcing the legend. From a sociological perspective, Annabelle became a modern relic. Relics in religious traditions serve as tangible links to invisible realities. They anchor belief. The glass case functioned as both prison and shrine. The warning sign amplified authority. Positively "do not open" does not merely prohibit action. It suggests danger. And danger, when undefined, is more powerful than any monster fully revealed. Meanwhile, the Warrens' broader body of work added weight to the narrative. Their involvement in cases that later inspired films such as The Conjuring expanded public interest. As their reputation grew, so did scrutiny. Critics accused them of exaggeration and theatricality. Supporters insisted that even if some details were dramatized, the core phenomena were authentic. The Annabelle story sits at the intersection of faith, fear, suggestion, and storytelling. It asks a question investigators still wrestle with today. When multiple witnesses report similar anomalies in a confined environment, how do we distinguish shared delusion from shared experience? The answer is rarely simple. And the doll, silent behind glass, continues to provoke that question. Long before Annabelle became a cinematic icon, she existed as a contained artifact inside a dimly lit room in Monroe, Connecticut. The Warren Occult Museum was not large, nor was it polished like a commercial attraction. It felt more like a storage space for unresolved stories. Religious relics stood beside alleged cursed objects. Masks, crucifixes, spirit boards, and handwritten case notes filled the room. And there, sealed inside a wooden and glass cabinet, sat the Raggedy Ann doll that had once lived in a student apartment. Visitors often described the experience as unsettling long before they stood directly in front of the doll. Human expectation alters atmosphere. When you enter a space already labeled dangerous, your nervous system becomes alert. Heart rate rises subtly. Peripheral vision sharpens. Sounds seem amplified. In that heightened state, ordinary sensations feel extraordinary. Annabelle's transformation from local case to global legend accelerated decades later when Hollywood adapted the Warrens' investigations into film. The Conjuring universe introduced audiences to a porcelain-faced version of the doll, visually engineered to evoke instinctive discomfort. Wide-set eyes trigger evolutionary threat responses. Uncanny facial symmetry disturbs the brain's pattern recognition systems. The cinematic Annabelle was designed to bypass rational thought and access primal fear. But the real doll never changed. She remained soft, stitched, almost absurdly innocent looking. That contrast deepened the mystery. How could something so visually harmless provoke such intense reaction? It forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable idea. Fear does not always arise from what we see. Sometimes it arises from what we believe might be hiding behind what we see. The Warrens maintained that Annabelle was not a possessed toy in the dramatic sense portrayed on screen. They argued that the doll was manipulated by a non-human entity seeking influence. According to their accounts, containment was essential. The glass case was not theatrical. It was protective. They claimed that a priest regularly blessed the museum to prevent escalation. Stories circulated over the years about visitors who ignored warnings. One of the most repeated tales involved a man who allegedly mocked the doll, tapped on the glass, and challenged it to act. According to legend, he later died in a motorcycle accident. No publicly verified documentation conclusively links the accident to the museum visit. Yet the story persists. Why? Because it reinforces narrative logic. Disrespect invites consequence. The legend protects itself. From a folkloric perspective, Annabelle functions as a modern cautionary myth. Myths evolved to encode social boundaries. Do not mock forces you do not understand. Do not invite what you cannot control. Whether one interprets the case spiritually or psychologically, the underlying lesson resonates. Investigators who later examined the museum environment noted something else. Many reported that Annabelle was not the most disturbing object present. Other artifacts allegedly connected to violent histories provoked stronger reactions. Yet Annabelle drew the most attention. Media coverage amplified her image. Once an object becomes culturally significant, its symbolic power expands beyond original events. There is also a neurological explanation for why dolls disturb many people. Studies in cognitive neuroscience suggest that human-like objects that fall slightly outside normal human appearance activate the amygdala, the brain's fear center. This phenomenon, often described as the uncanny valley effect, creates discomfort when something looks almost human but not quite. Although the real Annabelle does not resemble a human face closely, the concept of a child's toy animated by an unseen force triggers protective instincts tied to childhood vulnerability. The interplay between childhood innocence and corruption is psychologically potent. It destabilizes emotional safety. A doll represents comfort. If comfort becomes threat, the world feels unpredictable. Over time, Annabelle's reputation detached from specific evidence and attached instead to accumulated narrative weight. Paranormal researchers who never met Donna or Angie still reference the case. Online forums dissect minor details. YouTube investigators film reactions outside the now-closed museum building. Each retelling layers interpretation over memory. Yet behind the mythology lies a quieter truth. The original events occurred in a small apartment among young adults trying to live ordinary lives. No cinematic lighting. No dramatic soundtrack. Just confusion, fear, and the search for explanation. In 2019, Lorraine Warren passed away. With her death, a living link to the original case disappeared. The museum closed to the public due to zoning regulations and safety concerns. Annabelle reportedly remains secured under the care of those associated with the Warren estate. Occasionally, rumors spread online claiming the doll has gone missing or escaped. Each time, caretakers deny the claims. The rumors themselves demonstrate something revealing. The legend has become self-sustaining. It no longer requires new events to survive. So what remains when spectacle fades? A question. Was Annabelle a misunderstood psychological episode amplified by belief and retelling? Or was she evidence of something that operates just beyond measurable reality? The answer depends on which framework one trusts more. Scientific skepticism demands reproducible evidence. Demonological interpretation relies on patterns documented across centuries of religious testimony. Cultural analysis sees narrative evolution shaping collective fear. And the doll sits at the center of all three interpretations, unchanged, silent, impossible to interrogate. But the deeper mystery may not be the doll itself. It may be what the case reveals about us. When seasoned investigators speak privately about cases that linger in their minds, they rarely describe the most violent or visually dramatic incidents. What stays with them are the quiet cases, the ones that resist closure. Annabelle belongs to that category. Not because of overwhelming physical evidence, but because of persistent anomalies that never fully collapsed under scrutiny. Serious paranormal investigators, including critics of the Warrens, often emphasize documentation. Photographs, environmental readings, audio recordings, witness interviews. The Annabelle case originated in an era before digital monitoring became common. There are no high-definition recordings of the doll moving. No infrared footage capturing unexplained motion. What remains are testimonies, notes, and recollections. And yet, the absence of technological proof does not erase the psychological intensity reported by those involved. One recurring theme among investigators who later studied the case is behavioral pattern. They argue that random environmental disturbances tend to lack narrative coherence. Pipes make noise. Objects shift slightly due to vibration. Paper moves in air currents. But the Annabelle incidents reportedly followed a progression. Movement escalated into communication. Communication escalated into physical marks. Whether one interprets this as supernatural strategy or psychological pattern formation depends entirely on worldview. There is also the question of collective perception. Shared delusions, known clinically as folie à deux or even folie à plusieurs when involving more individuals, have been documented. In such cases, a dominant belief spreads within a close group under stress. But most documented shared delusions revolve around paranoia directed at social threats, not animated objects. That does not make it impossible. It simply makes it less common. Neurologists might point toward temporal lobe sensitivity. Research has shown that mild temporal lobe instability can heighten spiritual or paranormal interpretation of ambiguous stimuli. Individuals experiencing such sensitivity report feeling watched, sensing presence, or attributing agency to inanimate objects. However, for this explanation to fully account for Annabelle, it would require multiple individuals in the same environment experiencing similar neurological patterns simultaneously. Possible, but statistically uncommon. Some investigators instead focus on environmental psychology. Old buildings settle. Electrical wiring can produce low-frequency electromagnetic fields. Certain EMF ranges have been associated in laboratory conditions with feelings of unease or sensed presence. The apartment where the original events occurred was not heavily studied for environmental anomalies at the time. No detailed environmental report exists. That gap leaves room for speculation. Yet what continues to trouble even skeptics is the physical scratch incident involving Lou. If the wounds were superficial abrasions, they could have resulted from unconscious movement during a panic response. Human skin can be marked by fingernails without awareness, particularly during stress. But Lou reportedly insisted the marks appeared suddenly and in a pattern he could not replicate himself. Memory distortion over decades complicates certainty. Trauma alters recall. Retellings solidify narrative structure. Another dimension often overlooked is emotional investment. Once the doll was declared spiritually dangerous, every subsequent interaction reinforced its status. When visitors reported nausea or dizziness at the museum, expectation likely played a powerful role. Yet psychosomatic responses are not imaginary. The body responds physically to perceived threat. If someone truly believes an object is dangerous, their autonomic nervous system activates accordingly. Sweaty palms, rapid breathing, lightheadedness. The experience feels real because physiologically it is. This is where the Annabelle case becomes a mirror. It reflects the fragile boundary between belief and biology. It challenges investigators to ask not only whether something paranormal occurred, but how human cognition transforms uncertainty into conviction. Even today, caretakers associated with the Warren legacy insist that the doll remains contained for safety. They describe it not as theatrics, but precaution. They maintain that the case fits a broader pattern observed across cultures. In various religious traditions, objects are considered vessels through which intention can be directed. Whether through ritual, trauma, or belief, objects accumulate symbolic charge. Anthropologists call this concept object agency. Humans attribute meaning and even intention to physical items. A wedding ring carries commitment. A national flag carries identity. A relic carries sanctity. Annabelle carries fear. Once meaning attaches, it becomes nearly impossible to separate the object from its narrative. There is also the role of media amplification. Once films depicted a far more sinister version of the doll, public imagination merged fiction with case file. The cinematic Annabelle bleeds into memory of the real one. Even investigators must consciously disentangle dramatization from documented testimony. And yet, despite all rational frameworks, certain individuals who encountered the doll firsthand maintain that something about it felt wrong in a way difficult to articulate. They describe not spectacle, but atmosphere. A density. A stillness that felt aware. Such descriptions are subjective, but they recur. Science demands replicability. The paranormal rarely offers it. Instead, it presents singular events embedded in personal experience. That is why cases like Annabelle endure. They resist decisive classification. So investigators remain divided. Some conclude the case represents a powerful study in suggestion, stress, and narrative evolution. Others believe it reveals interaction with an intelligence that does not conform to conventional biology. Both positions acknowledge one thing: the story refuses to fade. And perhaps the final layer of this mystery lies not in what happened in 1970, but in why, decades later, the name Annabelle still triggers unease in people who have never seen the doll in person. The true story behind Annabelle does not end with containment. It does not conclude with a locked glass case or the passing of the investigators who first publicized the file. Instead, it continues quietly in the collective imagination, resurfacing in conversations, documentaries, online forums, and whispered retellings that blur the line between testimony and myth. The doll remains physically still, yet culturally active. To understand why Annabelle still unsettles investigators and audiences alike, we have to step back and examine something deeper than hauntings. We must examine narrative permanence. Most alleged paranormal cases fade because they lack structure. They are isolated, chaotic, poorly documented. Annabelle endured because the story unfolded with internal logic. It began with subtle disturbance, escalated into communication, progressed into physical harm, and culminated in removal and containment. That arc mirrors classic storytelling structure. Beginning, rising tension, climax, resolution. Even if the resolution is incomplete, the structure itself gives the case durability. But durability alone does not equal truth. It equals resonance. In modern psychological terms, Annabelle operates as a projection surface. The doll becomes a vessel for unresolved questions about agency, control, and vulnerability. Humans are uniquely sensitive to the idea that something lifeless might move without permission. It violates our most basic understanding of physics. Objects do not initiate action. When they appear to do so, the brain searches desperately for explanation. That search can lead to wiring faults, stress responses, deception, or, for some, spiritual warfare. Investigators who revisit the case today often approach it with more caution than either believers or skeptics expect. They acknowledge the limitations of 1970s documentation. They recognize the influence of media expansion. Yet many also admit that the consistency of the original witnesses' fear is difficult to dismiss entirely. Donna and Angie did not seek fame. They did not profit from their experience. In fact, they largely disappeared from public view. Their anonymity reduces the likelihood of deliberate fabrication, though it does not eliminate the possibility of misinterpretation. There is also the matter of cross-cultural parallels. Across continents and centuries, there are recurring reports of objects associated with disturbances. Cursed statues in Southeast Asia. Haunted masks in African tribal regions. Religious icons said to weep or bleed. While each case exists within its own cultural framework, the pattern is striking. Humans repeatedly encounter experiences they interpret as non-human agency acting through matter. Skeptics argue this reflects universal cognitive bias. Believers argue it reflects universal spiritual reality. Both acknowledge universality. Annabelle's story also intersects with a broader societal tension between science and mystery. In the 21st century, technology maps galaxies, edits genes, and simulates consciousness. Yet despite extraordinary progress, there remain corners of experience that resist measurement. Fear persists not because we lack data, but because data does not erase uncertainty. The unknown adapts. As explanations evolve, new ambiguities emerge. The doll's continued existence reinforces that tension. If it had been destroyed, the narrative might have ended. Destruction provides closure. Containment preserves suspense. The glass case symbolizes unfinished business. It suggests that whatever once operated around the doll could operate again. Whether one believes that literally or metaphorically, the symbolism is powerful. There is a final dimension investigators quietly acknowledge. Cases like Annabelle endure not only because of what may have happened, but because of how they make people feel. Fear is memorable. The brain prioritizes emotionally intense experiences. When visitors stand before the doll and feel unease, that sensation imprints. Later, when they recall the moment, the emotional memory amplifies details. The mind reconstructs the atmosphere with heightened drama. And yet, even after accounting for neuroscience, suggestion, folklore, and cinematic exaggeration, one fact remains unchanged. A simple Raggedy Ann doll triggered events that convinced multiple adults something beyond ordinary explanation was occurring. That conviction altered their behavior, drew in investigators, and generated a case file that continues to provoke debate half a century later. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Annabelle story is not whether a spirit inhabited a toy. It is the possibility that our understanding of reality is still incomplete. Not necessarily in the dramatic way horror films portray, but in subtler ways that challenge our assumptions about perception and agency. The true story behind Annabelle still terrifies investigators not because it provides clear evidence of the supernatural, but because it refuses to provide clear evidence against it. It exists in the narrow corridor between dismissal and belief. That corridor is uncomfortable. It demands humility. And maybe that is the real haunting. The doll remains motionless. The glass remains sealed. The warnings remain posted. But the question lingers in the mind long after the lights are turned off. If something did move that doll in 1970, what was it? And if nothing did, why are we still afraid?